Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's always good when the microphone is switched on when you try to start talking. Thank you to everybody for coming this afternoon to listen to me in conversation with Mark Isaacs, talking about his book, The Undesirables. I'm sure that for the people that have come here this afternoon, you may indeed know a little bit about the system of island detention that Australia runs, so we won't spend too much time going over that. But as you all know, one of the biggest problems with the story of asylum seekers and the Pacific solution is the lack of information, the lack of stories, and the lack of voices. There's been almost negligible media coverage from inside the camps, as you'll probably be aware, a little bit on Four Corners, and a story by a colleague of mine, Mark Davis, who did a story about not getting in. So this has been the story of the island detention centres ever since they were first opened, and certainly in this second iteration. And this is what makes Mark Isaacs' contribution so extraordinarily valuable, because we have in this book, and I hope in the conversation that we're about to have, a first-hand account and an extremely vivid account. And that's what struck me reading it, was that he transported me to Nauru, where he went to work for the Salvation Army. And for really for the first time, actually, in reading an account, I felt like I was living with the torpor and the boredom that we hear about but never get to understand in a visceral way. And this is what Mark has done so well, is to capture that and have the courage and also the hard work to come back and put it into a book that we can enjoy and talk about. Just briefly, I'm Sarah Ferguson, and I'm from the ABC. I'm currently working on 7:30 Report, but I come from the lovely home of Four Corners, where I've spent a lot of time also doing stories in this particular area. So I couldn't have been more delighted to be asked to speak to Mark this afternoon, but thank you very much indeed for coming. And I'll just start with Mark by asking you, if you would, for those of you who don't have a clear sense in your minds, a picture in your mind's eye of what Nauru is like, tell us about going there for the first time.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you very much for coming. It's an honour and a privilege to tell my story and the story of the asylum seekers that I worked with. Is that better? Okay. So thank you for coming. I think it's important when discussing the conditions of Nauru to get the idea of the preparation as to before we even went to the island. And when I called up, I was literally given a number by a friend of mine to call to try and work over there. And she said, this is the Salvation Army and they're hiring people. And so I called up, and the woman said yes. And I said, I'd like to go to Nauru. And she said, sure, when can you leave? And then a week later, I was actually flying to Nauru. And I didn't have a job interview. I wasn't given a job description or a mission brief or any idea of what the camp would be like or what my role was going to be there, and what the Salvation Army what their aims were in going over to the camp. And it was that lack of preparation that really epitomised the whole setup of this camp.
Well, actually, Mark, since you've gone back to that point first, why don't we just talk about that, which is, why did you pick up the phone and make that phone call?
I think because I didn't like my job. I was actually quite a comfortable job in the government, and it was quite boring.
What were you doing?
I was working for the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and I was organising, I wasn't even organising events, I was organising meetings to organise events. And they didn't seem to think that I could do it, which was probably most frustrating. And so when I had this opportunity to go to Nauru, it was this sense of curiosity and this sense of adventure. And I'd become involved in the asylum seeker debate about 6 months prior to this by visiting Villawood Detention Centre and experiencing the utter hopelessness of the men there who'd been detained indefinitely, waiting for refugee statuses to be determined, with no idea of when they could leave. And I knew I wanted to help in some way and become involved, and I also think this idea of just being part of this immigration history really appealed to me. So it was with that idea that I decided to leave. And
just tell us a little bit more about the leaving Australia, because the idea that this team of people with no particular expertise could be dispatched to an island to look after effectively asylum seekers waiting for their refugee determinations, but no particular body of skill. You describe them in the book as misfits. Who was with you when you took off that first time?
Yeah, well, I remember thinking for working for the Salvation Army, what kind of people would I be working with? And I was very scared that they'd all be retirees trying to convert people to...
Nothing wrong with retirees. He's very young.
But
the voice of youth speaks.
And there were many retirees, but then there was also 18-year-olds. There was a woman who didn't know what an asylum seeker was. There was even a guy who thought a safari suit was a fashionable item of clothing. So it was a very, very broad mix of people, but the one thing we had in common was this lack of expertise or experience working with refugees or asylum seekers.
And what were you actually being sent there to do?
Well, that's a good question. I think the idea, that the mentality and the ethos of the Salvation Army was to provide support for some of the world's most desperate people, and I think the ideal of going over there was quite was good. But I think in reality, getting over there, we really were left up to our own devices, and so, I mean, when we arrived, we were told to go out and help the men. That was literally the words used, and to be their friends. And now, working as a social worker and a case manager now for asylum seekers and being trained, finally, you do not be their friends because there's professional boundaries that you must keep. Unfortunately, with Nauru, that it was quite impossible to have professional boundaries, or near impossible, which might lead me back into the conditions.
Well, all right. So let's have you landing on the plane in the Pacific Island. What did Topside? That's the name of the camp where the men were detained. What did it feel like and look like when you arrived?
Well, it's important even before you get onto the island that as the plane comes in, one of the men described it as he thought they were landing on water because the island was so small that the plane enveloped it as it came in. And that distance from any other body of land and the remoteness and the I guess the size of this island are really important because it feels like you're in the middle of nowhere. The island is 20 minutes around by car on the one real main road, which closes when the planes come in. There's 10,000 local inhabitants. There are no jobs or very few jobs. There's no infrastructure or dilapidated infrastructure. It's very poor, and it's dotted with these abandoned refineries from the phosphate that was once what made the country rich, and it's quite a dirty island. So, the fact that it's so poor says to you when the Australian government comes here, and this is a country, may I add, that relies on Australian aid to survive, and so the Australian government says we're going to give a couple of $1 billion to have you house a few hundred asylum seekers. I think that was probably a good idea for them to take them from a nation point of view. And so you move away from these paradise beaches, and as you move closer and closer to the centre, you get towards you pass the abandoned phosphate refineries, and you get to the centre of the island, which is where all the mined out phosphate rock was. And it's just these pinnacles of rock, and it's devoid of vegetation, more or less, and it's extremely hot up there. Usually 40-degree days are quite normal. And in this area where there's no wind, you do feel like you're at the end of the world. And that's when you get to the camp. And before I get into the camp, for us workers, we were told that we were not allowed to talk to anyone about anything in the camp for all time. That this was what our contract stated. We were told that if we emailed loved ones with catchphrases like Nauru, and the ASIO would be checking and would fire us.
Were you given an explanation as to why that level of secrecy was necessary?
No, not an explicit kind of reason, but I think we all understood once we saw what was in the camp. And then you were also told that if you had political statements on Facebook, Twitter, then you could be fired. And one girl was fired for placing a political statement on Twitter. And so there was an overall sense that the whole atmosphere of the island was internalized. You couldn't talk about it. You couldn't leave the island while you were working there. You were constantly surrounded by this issue. If you went to the bar, you were referred to as a Salvation Army worker, and people would say, "Oh, I didn't know Salvation Army workers drank," things like that. And so it was always this. You were always working. It was very hard to break away.
So, go on, finish.
Yeah. So then you get into the camp where, again, it's a very small area, fenced-off area for the men, and then outside of that, we have our staff areas, our staff buildings, and so the men are housed within their own little detention centre, and they're placed in dark green army tents, and their beds were stretcher beds, 6 or 8 tents, stretchers to a bed, to a tent. It's extremely hot. Within those tents, it's 50 degrees Celsius in the hottest part of the day. And when it rained during the wet season, the camp flooded. The medical conditions, there was not enough medical resources for the men. They were given Panadol and water for all kinds of ailments. And the overall sense was the mental pressure. So being placed in this camp with nothing to do, with no idea of when they can leave. The first questions they asked us, why are you here? Why are we here? What are we doing here? When can we leave? And they were all questions that we couldn't answer. And so that idea of indefinite detention is what really creates this breeding ground for mental illness.
So when you arrived, given there was next to no preparation, and I think you said in the book that some of the other people who were there actually had their contracts handed to them at the airport, so no training, virtually no preparation. When you arrived, how did you go about doing what you figured out you were supposed to be there to do? It must have been quite a difficult thing to make the first step. Yeah,
so the first thing you do is you go in and you start talking to the men, which is at first a very daunting challenge. When I went to Villawood, the first man I met, the first thing he told me was that the second man I met, the first thing he told me was that his girlfriend had been murdered in Sri Lanka. The first man I met had rope burns from attempting suicide, so I already had an idea of the tragic stories. And then when you go in there to talk to these men, their first questions were, what are we doing here? You immediately struck with this idea that we were completely underprepared to meet these men's needs, and as was the camp. But within talking to them, you started to get an idea of who they were and what they needed, and you literally just helped them. So a lot of the men didn't have basic items like a mat for their stretcher bed, or a string to tie up their mosquito net. So you try and do that, but as was the nature of the camp, it was so disorganised that often these little tasks would take hours. What I immediately noticed was the fact that there was nothing to do, and that men would literally sit around just thinking about their families, thinking about their hopeless situation. One of the favourite games in Nauru was to throw a rock at a pole, and if you hit it, you won. But then the next thing you do was throw a rock at a pole again. So what I wanted to do was give them something to do, and it was something that I guess having fun is something I'm pretty good at. So,
all right, we'll come to those things you did in a moment, because they're a very interesting part of the book, the degree to which those events, small things, changed the lives of the men that you were interacting with. In the first instance, did you find that people wanted to talk to you? Did you find it easy to overcome the initial barriers?
That was dependent upon the person, and interestingly, I guess the ethnicity. So the Tamil men from Sri Lanka are extremely open. I think they understood straight away. They had an understanding that we were there to help them, and we were that kind face that were trying to do some good, and they were very, receptive of our assistance. I think some men were very suspicious because they'd been placed in this camp far away from nowhere, and then there was this idea that these people were supposed to help them when all they really wanted to know was when they could leave. And then there were some men that were very angry. They told us they'd been conned into coming to Nauru. Some told us they were going to be taken to Australia, and that's what the federal police told them, and then they found themselves in Nauru once they were eventually deported. Some said they were brought to Nauru in handcuffs. And so those Iranian men, we received Hitler salutes. One man, in the first few days I arrived, was sitting out in the sun, in the middle of the sun, at the gate, and was just sitting there and wouldn't move. And they actually tried to put a pergola over him to give him some shade, and then he'd move, and then they'd put a pergola over him. It was kind of comical in a sick way. But those forms of rejection and forms of, rebellion were there from the very start, and it took a while to show them that you were there to help them, and that was through actions. That's how I did it. I did it through actions and showed them that, this is what I'm doing for you. Yeah.
One of the things that's so striking about this particular phase of the Pacific Solution and what was going on at that time was you're probably aware, the arbitrary nature for those particular men. There were men who had arrived at Christmas Island or near the waters near Christmas Island on one boat. Some would end up being in detention on Christmas Island or eventually removed to the mainland. Others on the same boat would be removed to Nauru. And I wondered how difficult that was for people to handle that deep injustice of the arbitrary nature of people they'd even made the journey with, some of them not being with them, being separated from those men? How bad was the arbitrary nature of the detention?
That's a really good question. I mean, that played so much of a part of it. Why us? Why were we selected? And for these people, for the majority of them who feel like they've been prejudiced and oppressed against their whole life, to then have that happen to them again, it just compounded that victimization. It really played on them. They said, my life has always been like this. It's always been like this. Everywhere I go, I get oppressed. Even in Australia, the land of the free, where I was supposed to have my opportunity for safety and freedom, I'm the one put here while my friends are in Australia. There's actually one story. It was there was a group of men. There was 18 of them from one village in Sri Lanka, and 17 of them were in Nauru, and one of them was in Australia. And I said, you must feel happy for them. And they said, yeah, we think he's lucky, but he wants to be with us. But it did. And then on top of that, while they were in Nauru, being placed there while other people had been taken to Australia, they actually took people who had arrived after them and put them on bridging visas into Australia. So they'd been in Nauru for 3 or 4 months. And when that happened, it was even more of an injustice, because they were accused of jumping a queue, of cheating the system, and yet people who had arrived after them were then placed in Australia on bridging visas. So this queue that they'd been accused of jumping, it suddenly had no existence whatsoever, even if it was a queue made up by the Australian government.
Now, faced with that level of injustice, that feeling of injustice in the inmates, people call them clients and transferees. I can't stand all that vague, all that language that attempts to hide what it effectively is, so I will call them inmates if that's all right with you. Okay. You went to Nauru, I'm sure, with a sense of yourself as an essentially decent person going there to do good. How confronting was it for you to feel yourself part of that system, and how did you manage that? Yeah, so
it's I guess, an issue that we had to deal with every day as the workers, and it was something we discussed a lot, and it was the idea of being complicit in a system, and if no one worked in these camps, then it would never be able to function. But then there was the view that that people are always going to work in these camps, and if we step out, then someone worse can come in, and we knew that we were doing good and we were really helping the men, and we knew that we cared for the men, and again, if we stepped aside, would someone come in who would potentially abuse them? And we saw bad workers and we saw good workers, and so that was a constant struggle, and it became harder when you saw the really awful things happening to these men, the suicide attempts and the people going crazy, and you also felt angry that we were on the front line dealing with these emotions, dealing with all this anger and frustration, because someone in Canberra was decided that this was a good idea, and that they were never actually talking to the people and hearing their stories and dealing with what they really felt, the men really felt. And that even happened with the workers for the Department of Immigration. They rarely entered the camp, and when it was to do an official decree, and then they'd leave without having to. They'd leave while the people got angry, and we'd have to go in to placate them.
Did you have to overcome any desire, particularly in the early phase, to go home? Did you think about quitting and going back to Australia?
Yeah, I think we all did. Again, I would say that there was you can work outside the system and you can work within the system. And being given the privilege to work, I guess I wouldn't call it a privilege, but having the opportunity to work within the system, I knew that we could do good. And every time, for me and for a lot of my colleagues, every time we had the opportunity to quit, we always seemed to go back. And it was always for the men, because we didn't want to leave them there. And so the first 2 rotations, I actually refused to sign a full-time contract because I didn't know if I wanted to go back. And then eventually I said, yeah, I want the full-time contract, because I knew I could build a program that would assist the men.
All right, talk to us about some of the people that you met, because you formed some strong bonds. I know you're technically not supposed to do that, but who was the first person that you felt that you were able to really help and get through to?
Yeah, so the first man I met or became friends with would have been, I'm just trying to remember his name in the book, so I don't mention his real name.
Dev is one of the early ones.
Yeah, Dev Kumar. So again, that's a changed name. Dev was I guess a leader among the men. He was a Sri Lankan Tamil. He was tall, good looking, very skinny, and very charismatic. And so within about one day of being in the camp, he asked me if we could set up a cricket tournament. And so I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. And of course, Dev was the best bowler and the best batsman. And that's probably a reason why he wanted to set up the tournament. But he recognised that there was that he needed to entertain himself in some way. And he was a leader among the men, but he also had a troubling story because he was accused of being a people smuggler. And I got to know Dev really well, and we talked a lot about his story. And the first time I heard about it, they said, yeah, he's organising boats and bullying people for money. And it was the first time I had to question that idea of, well, maybe not the first time, but it was the first time I saw the reality of what a people smuggler might be, and it didn't seem like this evil person that they always talk about. And the way Dev Kumar described it to me was that he organised a boat for the people in his area, and now they owed money and he needed to get the money back to the people smuggler. That's just his story, that's what he tells me. He also told me about how he was kidnapped twice by the Sri Lankan government, and eventually decided that was enough and he didn't want to be captured again. And unfortunately, Dev Kumar is still in Nauru, and there's only 10 or 15 men left from the men that I worked with, and his condition has deteriorated dramatically because of this sense that he's being left there and forgotten. And the reason why he's still there is that after the July riots in 2013, the Wilson Security, who are running the organisation, running the court case against these men, decided that there was some ringleaders in the camp. And because Dev Kumar was seen as a leader, they said that he was one of the ones that orchestrated this July riot. Now, in all the other riots that I witnessed, the Tamils were by far and away the least likely to be involved in these things. They were always the ones that would try and avoid this kind of violence, most of all Dev Kumar. And the idea that this camp is, this court case, the Wilson Security and the Nauru government wanted to hold it within the detention centre, secret away from the media. And when the magistrate said he wouldn't do that, they sacked him and deported him. So now Dev Kumar is sitting here facing this trial that he says he was never involved in. And I think he's extremely worried, because if he is convicted, he's never going to be able to become a refugee again. He'll be in prison in Nauru. And to me, it screams of injustice, because I've seen the witness statements from previous riots, and one man was accused and his name wasn't even mentioned in a witness statement. And it wasn't until an Australian lawyer got to defend him that he got acquitted. So, and on top of that, when they arrested Dev Kumar, they said, "Hello, Mr. Journalist," an implication that he was being arrested because he'd been speaking to the media.
Just go back. We'll come back to the riots, because the circumstances leading up to them, you experience and know a number of the other people as well, the central characters in the riots. Again, those people that you got to know, how did you do that? You've got a group of people who were quite angry a lot of the time, resistant and suspicious, and to the point of paranoia in some cases. How were you able to get over that and become someone they could talk to?
So my initial, I guess my policy or goal was to find one man from every ethnicity that spoke English well, because we did have interpreters and we did have cultural advisors, but they were few and far between. So I wanted to be able to do my work independently of them. And so I found a man who spoke English quite well. And interestingly, a lot of the men do want to tell their stories. And they do want to open up, because they've spent so much time being oppressed and prejudiced against and being treated as lower than the majority, that when someone does speak to them on an equal level, they embrace it and they appreciate it. So in that sense, for a lot of the men, it was quite easy to connect. For the ones that were more troublesome, let's say I'll take the Iraqi group for one. When I first got there, they looked very intimidating. They had that guttural Arabic, and they were big men, burly men, and aggressive, potentially, looking men. And the minute I started talking to them, that stereotype of the terrorist immediately disappeared. They were extremely lovely men. They were very respectful to women. They stood every time someone came over and shook hands and offered women the seats. They joked around. One of the men had a joke where he'd dress up in the mosquito nets like a woman and pretend to be a lady to get all the men laughing. And just by talking to them and showing interest in their countries and talking to them on equal level, I got to know them. And one of the classic lines was there was two men. Omar, who was I guess he was a few years younger than me. He loved hip-hop, loved gangster movies. He read out the American Gangster, I want to pop a cap in your ass every time I walk by. And he was the man I knew very well of the Iraqis and spoke perfect English. And so one time I came back from a rotation, and Jabba, who was known as Antonio Banderas, and he had slicked back hair right back to here, and he took a lot of time manicuring it, taking care of it. He said something in Arabic, and Omar said, I'm not going to translate it. And I said, go on, do it, why not? And he goes, I won't. I go, what did he say? He said, some gay shit. And I said, what did he say? And he goes, so he groaned, and he goes, all right. He goes, every time you go away, Jabba gets sad, but every time you come back, he gets happy.
Talk to me about boredom, because one of the most striking features of any detention centre, and I imagine all the more so in the case of Manus Island and Nauru, is what boredom means for these people. We've all been bored at one stage in our lives, but this is, I think, a very special type of boredom. Tell us why it's so destructive in those circumstances. So
the idea of indefinite detention, when we have criminals, we give them a sentence, and they, stay in prison for 5 years or whatever it may be, and they have an end date, and they can look to that end date and say, in 5 years' time, I can see my family, or I can get a job, or do this. And they can cross off the days, so they have their calendar and they can cross it off. When you have indefinite detention, day 1 and day 2 are exactly the same. You're no closer to an end date. You have no more knowledge, no more information. Day 1 and day 100, you're still in the exact same position. There's no progress. There's no idea. There's no way you can tell your families, I'm almost out. There's no news to give them. So a lot of the men stop talking to their families. At the beginning they'd talk to them every day. By the time I left, some of them refused to call their families because it was too hard. They had no information to give them. In that setting, with nothing to do, all you really do is sit around and think about your families in their countries. These are countries that they've fled from, where there's persecution going on, and their families are still there. So they're worried about their families. They think constantly about their situation, constantly, and there's almost like this tick that they can't get rid of. It constantly goes back to that. So even have a conversation for 15 minutes, and eventually they'd go, and any more news about our future? They monitored the internet like frantically. They'd have information before we would, because someone would always be looking for news. And in that sense, when there's nothing going on, no progress, it makes it hard to go to sleep at night. When you haven't done any physical activity, because again, it's a very small camp. Some men actually got into routines of running around it, but that was very few. There was no physical exertion. You start to get depressed. You find it hard to sleep. There were insomniacs. And all of that contributes to the boredom. So it's not boredom like, I got nothing to do. It's boredom like, I have no purpose.
And again, at this stage, when you arrived, first of all, there wasn't even any processing going on, was there? The visas were not their refugee status was not moving forward at all.
Of the 500 or so men that I worked with in Nauru, not one has had their refugee status determined. They set up these faux interviews with immigration officers and lawyers and took down their details. And then when they were eventually told that they'd be given bridging visas to Australia, they were made to sign, or given the choice to sign a document that said your refugee processing will start again, and then you get to go to Australia, or refuse to sign that and stay in Nauru. And naturally, all of them signed it and got sent to Australia. At the time of writing this, when I was at the court case, it was revealed, this is 7 or 8 months after it first opened, it was revealed that the Nauruan government didn't have any resettlement policies. They hadn't got any agreements with new countries. They hadn't got anything to do, any policies in Nauru. And what's interesting is now they've actually they're talking about, they're saying that people are being resettled in Nauru now. The idea of processing people through the Nauruan system, this is a system that got created in the last year. The people got trained in the last year. A lawyer told me that in one of the actual training sessions for one of the Nauruan officers, immigration officers, the man mentioned, the client, the asylum seeker mentioned that he was a homosexual and he was facing homosexual persecution. And he told me the Nauruan immigration officer became physically uncomfortable and had to leave. And these are the people processing asylum seekers. And then even if they are resettled on Nauru, how much, I guess, sustainability does this program have? It's an island of 10,000 people. How many more can they put on there when there are no jobs, no infrastructure, no produce? It's just, I mean, I find it very hard to see how that continues. And the latest news I've heard is that they've actually deported some Afghans back to Afghanistan because of negative clearances, negative determinations. And that happened under Howard, and a good friend of mine went over to investigate what happened to those people, and half of them were killed.
So going back to the period when you're there, I think there were only single men there. There were no families, no children, no unaccompanied minors. So you've got a camp with hundreds of, more young than old, but hundreds of single men. You've talked already about the boredom. Self-harm was obviously a huge part of life in all of the detention centres in Australia, epidemic levels. When did you become aware of it? And given that you had thought you were going there again to help these people, what was it like dealing with that?
Yeah, so that was without a doubt the most confronting side of the camp, and it became evident almost straight away that people were harming themselves. But the first suicide attempt was after about 3 weeks, and was the reason why I first started writing the book. But the self-harm...
Tell us about that, because that motivation was something I was going to ask you next. So talk about that event and
so there was a man named
thinking.
Shahab, who was or at least referred to in the book as Shahab, who was an Iranian Kurd. But as many of you may be aware, the Kurdish are considered stateless and a stateless ethnicity, and a lot of them are not recognised by any nation, and so don't have a home country. And so he fled Iran due to the persecution against these Kurds, and he was fleeing on behalf of his family. And so the day that Shahab was a very lovely man. He didn't speak English, and he had a very thick Iranian, thick moustache, and he only ever said thank you. That was the only English he knew. And so he would say thank you for everything, and it was humbling, but at the same time kind of embarrassing, because you wouldn't do anything and he'd still say thank you. And one day I was walking into the camp, and I saw Shahab lying in the back of an ambulance. And he'd found his wife had called him on behalf of her family and believed that he'd taken the money and run, and that she didn't believe that he was in Nauru and didn't know about this policy and didn't understand it, and thought that he was in Australia with all the money. And so Shahab found himself in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no idea of where he was, why he was there, how he would get out. And the whole reason for him making this journey was to bring his family over to Australia. And so without a family, why the hell was he here? And so he attempted suicide by taking one of the cords from the tents, and the very thin cords, and trying to hang himself from one of the tents. And so I went in there to talk to the men who I considered my friends, and I guess share their grief. And it was not the first time, but the most distinct time that I recognised that as much as I wanted to be their friends and called myself their friends, I wasn't their friend. And that I was a worker and they were a client, or I was a jailer and they were the inmates. Because going in there was the divide. This was happening to them, it wasn't happening to me. And this was our government, our policy, and our country doing this. I could leave the camp and go back to my families, and they couldn't. And so being on the forefront of that anger and the injustice and the grief, I couldn't. I mean, they accused me that it was my fault, that I had done this to them, and I couldn't disagree with them. I didn't feel like I could say that it wasn't my fault at that point in time. And so walking out of there was a very horrible sensation, for one, because of what had just happened, but for two, the actual grief and of the situation overwhelmed me, and I left because I didn't want to be in that camp any longer. And that made it even sadder because I knew that these people couldn't leave. And so this place was that bad, and yet they were stuck in there and had to try and go to sleep in these tents. And so I went back to my room and I wrote one of the chapters of the book, and I haven't changed that chapter at all since. And from there I began to record more and more of the emotional, the really emotional, be it happy, because there were some really great moments, but then also the tragic ones. And coming back to Australia, I came back and after the first 4 weeks, and I remember being in a party, and it was a really good party. It was at my house, and a good Halloween party. And people came up to me, and everyone was drinking and dancing and having a good time. And they said, "How was Nauru?" And I said, "Good," because I couldn't begin to describe what I'd just experienced. How do you start with something like that, especially in a party situation? And then some of my friends pressed harder, and they said, "You know, what really happened?" And then I'd have this kind of verbal diarrhea of suicide attempts and self-harm, and they'd back off and go like, "Whoa, it's a bit too much." And it was hard to really express that in a way that wouldn't be overwhelming for people. And then it was only through showing a friend of mine my writing, he seemed to understand what I'd been through and seemed to understand the situation. And I realised that I had this window into this dark world that no one was allowed to know about, and that the government was suppressing information on. And so through that I began to really flesh out the book.
Did you understand, obviously you're not a psychiatrist, you don't have a medical background, but did you come to understand the things that were causing men to fall apart? There's one particularly strong description of one of the older men who was considered a religious leader who fell apart under the stress. Can you describe what happened to him, and also how you understanding what was going on over the longer period of time you were there?
Yeah, so I think the way that the mental illness manifested itself in Nauru was through self-harm first and foremost, and that was, one of the men described it to me as, we hurt ourselves because we don't want to hurt anyone else. And so that was one of the first and foremost things, and it was through cigarette butts and blunt paper clips to sew up their lips and slash wrists and things like this. But then there was, on one side there was a sense of hopelessness. They had no power to change their fate. There was nothing they could do that could change this situation, except maybe return to these countries that they fled from. And the fact that 99% of them didn't return, kind of must say something to you. I also think they went through avenues of appeal. They put in these written requests for someone to talk to them, which never ever really got any kind of traction. They did peaceful protests, and unironically they said, why bother doing peaceful protests, because Australian people don't care about peaceful protests. And as you're probably well aware, that the media didn't report about peaceful protests. And they did, for months and months, they did these peaceful protests without any kind of coverage of it. So then they did hunger strikes and thirst strikes, and suddenly the media was awash with hunger strikes of ungrateful asylum seekers. And we saw men get to the point where they were being, every time they fell asleep or passed out, they'd have drips applied so they could bring them back to life. And for 2 weeks we were pressing the government to send this man to Australia, and he was eventually sent to Australia for treatment, and the minute he was better they returned him. So on that sense there's two things I raised there, that they didn't have a voice. There was no way they could express themselves or express their anger. They had no one to talk to. Every avenue of appeal they went through, which eventually led to the frustrations of the riots. And then also there's this vindictiveness to the policy that a lot of people don't see. The returning of men, even though they know they're mentally ill. One man was sent to Australia for an urgent surgery. They booked him in for a surgery that was going to take, I think, 3 weeks or something. And then they actually got a second option that was going to take a day. And he said, no, I want to take the 3-week one, thanks. And they said, no, too bad. And they sent him back to Nauru without getting any surgery done as a punishment. And so there's those ins and outs that people don't know about that say to me this isn't, this isn't a fair policy, among other things. But it's the constant pressure that way. So you've got hopelessness, a sense of powerlessness. Then you've got the basic, with this depression that comes with being in the camps, you've got insomnia, awful sleeping patterns, nothing to do, the boredom. And then in the case of the mullah, there was a bombing in Pakistan, in Quetta, and it was in the Hazara Square, which is where the Hazara race, I guess, have their market. So it was a racially targeted bombing. And for most of the men in the camp that I worked with, they knew someone who'd been killed or injured in that bombing. And so the mullah was one of them. And his story is one that dates back a long time, but he had family who died on trying to come to Australia by boat that crashed. He had a son that was sick, and he tried to send money back to the son to get him treatment, and there was a clerical error and his son died. There was the bombing that killed his family, and this man who was a religious leader in the camp who supported all the men and was a figure for most of the men to go to and ask for advice and talk to, he went crazy. The pressure got too much for him, and he had a psychotic episode and was in the camp for 3 days before he was taken out.
And how did that manifest itself? When you say he had a psychotic episode, what was he doing?
He was running around the camp barking like a dog at some points. He'd lay in his bed frantically going back and forth, speaking gibberish. I wasn't there for the whole 3 days, but that's, from what I gather, that's what I know about it. And it was clear that he was unwell, and yet it took 3 days to get him to be taken to Australia. And he was put into a hospital and then placed in Villiers Detention Centre for months on end.
And were you shocked to see someone whom you'd regarded as one of the stronger men there collapse in that way?
Yeah. It was just very confronting. And it came at a point when there was this point in my time where I thought, well, we've got to have a policy, and we can't have people coming on boats, so maybe this is okay, maybe this might work. It's not so bad after all. And then when seeing him going crazy, it just brought it all back to me, just how awful this thing was. And it really was a way to make people go mad. And men have been saying it for months on end, but that was the first physical, manifestation of the mental illness that I saw in terms of actual going crazy. Yeah.
Now, just in terms of the riots, because obviously we've seen, again, a series of riots on Manus Island this year, just explain, if you can, in the midst of all that boredom, the torpor, but at the same time this obsessive looking all the time at information and watching the news and following every single development in policy and immigration policy in Australia, how those two things come together to create that atmosphere that led to particularly the very big riot.
Yeah, so I call it the cycle of violence, and it was this build-up of pressures that would, almost like a boiling pot, and it would build and build and build, and there's the overarching frustrations, the lack of certainty about their future, the lack of knowledge about what's going to happen to them. Then there's the day-to-day frustrations, not being able to get the items you want, not having to wait 2 hours to see the doctor, terrible food or whatever it may be. And those start to build, and those start to build. And then you also have a camp, we call them asylum seekers, but we have 6 or 7 different ethnicities. We have multiple religions. We have homosexuals and heterosexuals. We have a multitude of different types of people coming from different backgrounds. And interestingly, a lot of them were not very accepting of each other, and were actually trying not to be the lowest in the camp. And so people fleeing from prejudice, placing prejudice on other people is quite, disappointing in a way. But you have this camp that's constantly at each other's throats in some ways, but it would build. So it would build and build and build and build, and then it would only take, the straw that broke the camel's back to set people off. And often it could be from an argument over who had the right to watch the television. A simple thing, but would be, a representative of bigger racial tensions. or tensions against the government, and so eventually these things erupted. And I think on one side, the two riots that I witnessed, one was caused by the government telling the men that they were going to be in Nauru for at least 5 years, and that was the first time they were told anything about their future, and it was only 3 weeks in, and a group of men went about and destroyed parts of the camp, and then faced charges over it. The second one may have been seen as an incitement. There was synchronized wrist slashings and rocks were thrown at guards. But then within that, the whole camp gets thrown up, and there was, one of these asylum seekers tried to assault a Salvation Army worker, and all these different things going on. And I mean, it's easy to say, but yeah, it could be incited. But at the same time, there's no order to these things. They're quite chaotic, and within that, there was another kind of incident. And then finally, the one in the July riots, again, it was, from what I've gathered from the men I worked with and my colleagues, that it was, again, based on smaller issues, and it was only a very small group of men that actually got fired at the camp. But there's a lot of interesting questions as to how they got lighters. Apparently, the officials knew that this was going to happen and had been reported 3 or 4 days earlier, and yet it somehow seemed to come about.
Well, I'm going to throw open to questions in a moment or two, so have a think if there's anything you'd like to put to Mark. But at the same time, you were able to bring some joy in the time that you were there. For you, what is your happiest memory of that time?
I can think of specific moments, and then I can think of just the overall getting to know these people as people, and understanding that their stories, and understanding their desires and needs. And there's 2 moments. Can I choose 2? The first one was actually getting the men into swimming, and because I mean it's such a hot camp and the pressures are so great, and taking them outside that camp. And I'm going to meld a few ideas into this one, but the minute we got these men on excursions and took them outside the camp and left the gates, you could see their attitudes rise up and their moods change, and they started smiling and singing and dancing in the aisles, and then getting them into the water. That the act of just cleansing themselves was, I think, literal and the idea of cleansing their souls, and it was beautiful to see them frolicking like children. And then on the other side, within the camp there was these amazing moments where the Sri Lankan men actually had these birthday parties, and one of the men took me into one of the tents for the birthday party, and they had this humble arrangement of food, of a few packets of chips and a few apples and a few bottles of Coke that they'd share between them all. And then one of the men pulled out an origami paper camera, and said, "Photos, please." And we all lined up and took photos, and it was a Polaroid, so we'd pull it apart and take out the little piece of paper that he'd drawn pictures on and hand them out. And then the guards came and they said, "Hide the camera." So they were quite creative. And another one was with one of my very dear friends, and it was Valentine's Day, and we decided to draw up Valentine's Day cards that had roses and cupids and love hearts on them, and we scribed them with things like roses are red, violets are blue, there are no women in Nauru, so I choose you. And then we hid them under men's pillows, and it was only a few months later that I read one of the case notes for one of the guys, and it said, "I found a Valentine's Day card today and I was very happy."
Just before I go to questions, your reasons for writing the book, you'd obviously got involved in the court case that was challenging the notion of this detention in Nauru being legal. You'd been through that. You and some of your other Salvation Army workers had joined together to make a public statement condemning the situation. What made you go the next step and write a book?
For me, the very first step of being there was, I guess a rejection of what the government wanted. We were told that our job was to help the men, and yet the policy of this camp was to make it as awful as possible for them. So from day one, we were already against, and we were told constantly we were acting on the wrong side by helping them. And throughout the camp, it was so frustrating to see the constant lies and mistruths that the government handled to oppress these people even further. And then speaking out in court was a decision based on the fact that they tried to use the excursion program that I set up to assist the men. They tried to use that as an example of the freedoms they had, which justified putting them in detention. And so for me, I couldn't let something that I'd created become I guess the justification for keeping them in detention. And then leaving and having people still have no idea what was really going on there. And people still condemn asylum seekers for their actions in these riots with no real understanding of why they were doing it. I knew that having shown my friends this book and having them see the reality of deterrence and having that change their minds, that I could hope that this would show other people.
All right, now if anyone's got any questions, at the back there, the lady with the glasses first with the black hair, they're just going to bring a microphone to you.
Hi, firstly, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
My question is that since you've left Nauru, both women, families and unaccompanied children have now started being sent to the camps under a no exceptions policy. I wondered what your thoughts are on what impacts that will have on the men in Nauru, but also the people that are now being sent there.
Yeah, so again, I didn't work with women and children in Nauru, but I had friends who did and who told me of what they'd witnessed in Manus Island. And you know, there's stories of children saying that they want to kill themselves, and pictures they've drawn of self-harm and being put in jail, signed with their boat IDs rather than their names. I did an interesting lecture, an interesting talk the other day, and it was, I didn't do it, I was there, and it was about women at risk. And this woman had done a study on refugee women in Australia, and she found that 80 to 85% of refugee women have suffered some kind of sexual abuse in their lives. And so the idea of placing them in these detention centres where there is sexual abuse, it seems so against a duty of care that we deserve these people. My father's a doctor, a paediatrician, and he works with children, and he's deemed the placing of children in detention as a form of child abuse. The restriction of their freedom, the lack of education, being surrounded by self-harm and suicide attempts, and just the very idea of treating them less than others, than Australian children.
There was another gentleman at the back before. Yes, if you can shoot the mic over to him.
Mark, it's probably difficult for you to comment on this crazy idea the government now has of shifting the people from Nauru to Cambodia. I've worked one year in Cambodia for the UN, and the government there is totally corrupt. They're supposed to be giving them $40 million to help in this process, but it'll immediately go into the pockets of the generals and the government workers up there.
Well, it's a very good point you raised. Perhaps I could put it to Mark in this way, which is that now that a number of people in Nauru are going to be settled, albeit temporarily, in Nauru, given that you've actually been to Nauru, can you imagine what that is going to be like?
So again, I'd reiterate just in the Nauru sense that there are no jobs, there's very little infrastructure, it's a very poor island, it's an island of 10,000 people, and given what happened in July 2013 after the riots, the way they dealt with the riots, the president of Nauru, I guess, called for an emergency police force to help quell the riots, and it was a Friday night, which is when most Nauruan men are drunk. And they came and then he signed them in and swore them in, and they went up to the camp with machetes and bats and attacked a lot of the asylum seekers. And then those placed in prison, they were rounded up regardless of whether they knew that if they were involved or not. Put them, a lot of them, over 100 in prison. And the men claimed they were trying to flee from the fire and were taken by the Nauruans and put in prison and were denied food and water. One of the men accounted to me that when he asked for water, they said you can drink out of the toilet. And I guess the overall, what I'm trying to paint here is this idea that there's a lot of resentments towards refugees and asylum seekers at the moment, from what I've heard. that the Nauruans harbour against them. And I think trying to settle these people in this atmosphere doesn't seem conducive to protecting them. Having said that, it's better than being in the detention centre. But I think just the idea of paying smaller, worse-off countries with worse human rights, or apparently worse human rights records than us, to deal with our responsibility seems, I guess, against the whole nature of this refugee convention that we've signed.
A question down at the front. I think we've got time for, this is probably our last question.
Okay.
Just on the sheer practicalities of it, what can we do, A, to get the information out that you're putting out there, so that we can say to our fellow Australians, we are responsible for this. Regardless of whether we think we're saving people from drowning, we are directly responsible for what we're doing to people there. So I think your book's fantastic, and I think what you're doing is fantastic, and I just want to know how we can get that out further and try and stop it, because it's being done in our name, it's being done against the UN Convention, it's absolutely unjust, and yet we've got a whole lot of both major political parties unfortunately supporting it. So I suppose I'd like to appeal both to the audience and to you up there to say, what can we do to promote what you're saying and to try and stop it, because I think we have to.
I'd say buy my book and give it to everyone you know. I think, I mean, there's two avenues. There's the political leadership that we so desire, and I think in that sense we're not going to get it. But it would be wonderful. Again, my parents told me a story about the King of Denmark. When the Jews fled Nazi Germany, they went to Denmark, and the Germans said that you have to put a yellow star on all the Jews. And the King of Denmark said, well I'm going to wear one. And then all the Danes wore a yellow star. So in that sense, if we had some kind of political leadership, that would be wonderful. But I think to get that, the way that I see our political environment at the moment is that they'll only do what they think will get them votes. And so to get votes, you need to convince the Australian public. And I think what's really important in talking about this and spreading the word about this is not to be vitriolic and, because often the left can say, I believe in human rights, therefore I'm better than you. And when I go out there, I just assume that there's what leads anti-asylum seeker opinions is not necessarily some kind of racism or some kind of hatred against or cruelty against people. I think it's a ignorance, and that by becoming informed and knowing what the issues are and understanding and being able to meet these people and really have a sound knowledge of this, that would be the best possible way, and present it in a dignified manner. Don't attack people because their view is different. It's just maybe they've had a different understanding and they're not quite on that level. And I did have another point.
Well, let me make a final point, because I think we're going to have to wrap up. But in fact, although Mark's point about his book is a good one, and you should buy it, and there is a Glebe book stand here at the festival for anyone who doesn't already have a copy, he was making an advertisement for his book, but actually what his book contains is a true picture of what's happening in Nauru, and that's why it is so powerful. As I said at the beginning, there is very little information out there. There are very few vivid accounts. The voices are not heard. And as a journalist, my biggest interest is in truth, and that's why I admire the book, because he brought us a part of the truth of the history of the Pacific solution, which no one else has managed to do to date, and for that I salute you, and I thank everybody for coming to the Sydney Writers' Festival this afternoon to hear him, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you. Mark? Well done.